opening and the trade relationship.
Right.
Like the Cubans say that they've lost more than $1 trillion worth of wealth by being denied this trade facilitation with America and all that. So the American policy of diplomatic isolation and economic sanctions has worked against Cuba is fine.
Right.
But if America, in 2013 voting that took place in UN, only two countries opposed that motion which castigated America. That was America and Israel.
Right.
Rest every other country, including Americans allies, they criticized America for not opening up to that place. So I think America will gain quite a lot of heft in the Latin American countries who were always against America's intransigence in this matter.
In fact, we have heard series of viewpoints. In fact, Ted Cruz has said that this very initiative by Barack Obama is an aim to legitimize the corrupt and oppressive Castro regime. So people within US also, and many of these Republican candidates earlier have also openly criticized. But overall, the very approach of United States at this juncture and the very initiative which was earlier announced in December 2014, how things will really move in from here?
You know, the debate in the US is going on for quite some time. It's nothing new. You know, many people are struck by the fact that Obama has finally become the first president after 1888 to visit Cuba, about almost 9 decades, 88 years and all. But ever since 2000, for the last 15 years, incremental steps have been taken by the US Congress, and from 2009 onwards, even the White House, to slowly and steadily improve relationship with Cuba. Whether it is beginning with allowing the family to travel, then sending remittances by the Cuban Americans to their family members, then again elevating it to remittances by anyone to Cuba, then facilitating travel, restoration of crews, opening up the American airports to have some kind of chartered flights to Cuba. There's so many issues. Step by step, Congress has done it in a very incremental fashion. Slow but steady. And right now what is happening is the culmination of that process which began in 2000 itself. Cuba was subsidized by the Soviet Union during the Cold War time by $2 billion for the sugar industry. In 1962, the world was about to go for a nuclear war, again because of Cuba. And after the end of the Cold War and Soviet Union collapsed, actually the US Congress enacted two legislation in 1992.
So for all those who are calling it a superficial transition, you're saying that this is indeed a very bold and a very serious and genuine initiative by the President to actually move ahead with, as far as relations with Cuba is concerned?
The debate in the US is like this. Those who are opposing it, they are saying, you put rather little more pressure on Cuba so that there is democracy and dictatorship ends. Rather than show him different kind of lollipop and dangle him so that he becomes stronger by this kind of initiative. But those who support it, they say, look, for 54 years we have been trying to isolate Cuba and we have been implementing some kind of trade embargo. What have we benefited out of it? Rather, people who talk about America isolating Cuba have found that Cuba has consistently isolated America in the Western Hemisphere.
Who is isolating whom? Because is it Cuba who's isolating US, or it's US who's isolating Cuba? Because at this juncture, after 55 long years, things hasn't really helped as far as the alienation and isolation which the US President earlier was also talking about. Is there strong realization? And if as far as President Obama is concerned, his policy in Syria or be it Libya has failed. So there's also there are many who say that this initiative comes from that realization that things haven't really worked the way you wanted it to work.
Let's look at the size of Cuba, and just there at the doorstep of the United States of America. Last 55 years, it has really suffered. If you go to Cuba, you realize what an embargo can do to an economy. So surely in terms of when it comes to economic standpoint, Cuba has really suffered. In fact, it's been driven in the arms of Soviet Union for long years. If you remember, Fidel Castro was very keen that he should be closer to the US, but that was spurned, and after that whatever we see is history. But if you look at the initiative by President Obama, it is he's been very keen that the ties between the two countries start gaining traction, and he's worked towards it. And I think it's probably a crowning glory for Obama when he demits office in January. There'll be two things that he can really look back. One is the P5+1 deal with Iran, and the other one is Cuba. And in a certain way there is a lot to show, because you have it's so difficult to shake off or build support for Cuba in the United States of America, because these people Cubans who are there in Florida, they make so much noise. They occupy all the headlines, they
And when
occupy
we
the
talk
entire
about the
narrative.
new world order, you know, especially when
But
we
you look at the newspapers, you look at how the American media writes. It's
Right.
entirely from their standpoint. They talk about democracy, human rights, this, that and the other. But the other aspects are all lost.
Okay.
And what President Obama is trying to do is bring in about 40 CEOs there, helping them build up some kind of support within the US economy, who are going to lobby hard so that the US Congress contributes.
Exactly.
in
I'll
lifting
I'll
it.
come to that also, that the US is looking for economic recovery, and Cuba has that great potential in offering that opportunity in terms of giving business and entrepreneurship a big opportunity. Cuba is also looking for investment. But in terms of you know, this initiative by President Obama and the way he's failed in many other countries, be it Syria or Libya, is there a realization that hostile relations with countries will not really help? We have seen this rapprochement happening with Iran earlier and now with Cuba.
No, I think Obama has a far more sophisticated way of handling what you might call adversaries.
Right.
In the case of Cuba, it's very clear. He has not given up his idea that Cuban people must have more democracy. He said it openly. And openly with Raul Castro, he's had a dialogue, said he should have more democracy. And Raul Castro, on the other hand, has said, well, in the US you also have people who are very poor, there's
Right.
racism, and you have a lousy
healthcare
healthcare
facilities.
system. So Obama said, yes, well, okay, we are willing to discuss it. So there's a human rights dialogue, as well as lifting whatever he can do to lift the restrictions he's doing. The rest is up to Congress.
The rest
It's
is
not
up to
going to be
Congress.
easy.
Lifting embargo is not really
And he said, in a presidential year, the Congress is less than productive. That's very clear what he's saying, that after me, there will be another president, another Congress. But somebody asked him, and he said that, well, he thinks that this process will go on to the next administration.
Right. So
Because
will things really
it's not
change?
reversible.
Right. Will things really change for Cubans? That's the bigger question. And if the trade embargo can really be lifted, because that all depends on the Congress. Time now for me to slip into a short break. Next, when we come back, we'll also talk about specifically about challenges in Cuba, and will this new initiative really change things for the local people there. Stay tuned.